What's up guys, welcome back to another Warhammer Tacticus video. In today's video, as promised, I'm going to be reviewing all the Xenos units. I just wanted to make a quick correction to my last video where I looked at all the Chaos units. I said Ahriman was pretty mid and not really that good, but he does have one particular use that makes him really powerful, and that's with his passive ability. In the Neuro Guild Raids team, this passive ability is super important and can buff your entire team's damage by up to 30%, which is super powerful. Otherwise, he's still a pretty niche unit and not really good in any other game modes, but in this specific instance, he is very powerful. Alright, so let's just jump right into it. Our first faction is the Necrons. Use them in the Indominus Mirror campaign. Their faction passive is Living Metal, so they regenerate 10% of their max health at the start of each turn and are also considered mechanical. Our first character is Makotep. His passive ability is Relentless March, which gives +1 movement to all friendly units in adjacent hex and also restores the health of mechanical units each turn. And his active ability triggers basically an extra action for a non-character friendly unit, such as a summon. It is particularly useful in combination with Alfn. If you use Alfn summons that can duplicate themselves and use this ability on one of them, you can get up to 3 of Alfn summons in a single turn. Overall, Makotep's a pretty decent character. He's obviously required for the campaign, so you should focus on him at least for that. But his passive ability is super useful in game modes like Legendary Release events, where you need to survive for long periods of time, and that passive healing can really add up over the turns. And his active ability is a decent support for Alfn, who's already one of the most powerful characters in the entire game, and who we're going to look at pretty soon. Focusing on this guy, I would focus mostly on his passive ability, as his active only increases the damage as you level it up, and it's more about getting more bodies on the field than actually them doing so much damage. Next is Emospec, and he has the passive Overwatch, so if he has an attack this turn, during the enemy's turn, he'll attack the first enemy that comes into range. His passive ability makes it so that his Overwatch attacks deal additional damage, and that whenever he kills an enemy with his Overwatch, he'll remain in the Overwatch state. His active ability is a ranged damage dealing attack, which if it kills the enemy, will also hit the next adjacent enemy that's also within range. Overall, Emospec's a pretty decent unit. You need him for the campaign, so I would focus on him a bit for that at least. He really excels in game modes like Onslaught and Legendary Release events, where you have to fight against waves and waves of enemies, and his passive Overwatch ability can clear out a ton of units each turn without you having to do anything. I would recommend focusing on his passive ability for those uses. Otherwise, his active ability is okay, but it's not super important, and I would focus most of your resources on his passive and building him up for the campaign. Our next character is Alfn. He has the passives Explodes, Flying, and Mechanic, so he can heal a friendly mechanical unit as his action each turn. His passive ability will heal a random friendly adjacent mechanical unit either when he moves to them or at the end of his turn. His active ability summons 2 Scarab Swarms that immediately attack the enemy, and these Scarabs are super strong as they can duplicate themselves, so over time this can really snowball and you can fill the entire battlefield with Scarab summons. Overall, Alfn is an insanely strong character. He's a Necron I recommend focusing the most on for the campaign, and he also has uses in a ton of different game modes. He's useful in guild raids against Mortarion because his summons have so many hitboxes. He's useful in Legendary Release events. He's useful as a healer. He's also useful as a damage dealer. Overall, he's a super important character. I would recommend focusing the most on his active ability and pumping up his Scarabs as high as you can get them. But I wouldn't neglect his passive either, as this healing can be really important, especially in game modes like Legendary Release events and Onslaught, where you just want to park Revos and Alfn together, so Alfn can just heal up Revos every turn, and you can take down tons of enemies that way. Next is Tutmos, and he has the trait Flying. His passive ability makes it so that he deals direct damage to a random adjacent enemy each turn. And his active ability deals direct damage to a target and up to 2 random enemies within 2 hexes. Overall, Tutmos is a pretty weak and underwhelming character. His abilities do direct damage, so he can't crit, so his damage numbers seem weak at lower levels. Also, he's super squishy, so I wouldn't really recommend focusing on this guy, especially for the campaign, as he'll usually just get one shot and is more of a liability than a help, if anything. So overall, I'd say this unit is pretty much a miss. All the other Necrons are so much more powerful, and I wouldn't really recommend using your resources to level up this guy. Our last Necron is Fett. His passive makes it so that he deals damage to a random adjacent enemy at the start of his turn. And his active ability will summon a Necron warrior for each round that has passed, or each Necron that has died this game. These summons are super tanky and can deal a ton of damage. Overall, Fett's a super powerful character. His active ability is really strong as the turns go by, and you can get more and more summons off of it. It's usually the best strategy to hide him in the background until you can get like 2 to 3 summons, and those summons can usually clean up all the rest of the enemies for you. Overall, I do recommend focusing a bit on Fett, especially if you have him. He can be super useful in the campaign and help you beat some levels you otherwise couldn't, especially with his active ability. If you want to focus in this guy, I would recommend just focusing on his active, as his passive is pretty weak and won't do enough damage to be super important even at higher levels. Our next faction is the Orcs, and use them in the Octarius campaign. They don't have a faction-specific passive, so we're just going to get into our first character, Snotflaga. His passive abilities are Get Stuck In, so for every 2 hits he scores, he has a 30% chance to score an additional hit. He also has Beast Slayer, so he does 20% extra damage to big targets and vehicles. His passive ability makes it so that he spawns a friendly Grot that immediately attacks the enemy every time he attacks. And his active ability summons a Grot in each adjacent hex that also has an enemy adjacent to it, so you can score a couple of Grots off of this ability. Overall, I know I said the Orcs were weak, but Snotflaga is pretty much the only exception. He just got a rework, so he's actually pretty powerful now. His passive ability is really good and lets you get a summon out every turn, and his melee attacks also do a ton of damage because his Squig Hound also attacks with him. So overall, I would recommend focusing on this guy, mainly for the campaign. He also has a lot of uses in PvP like Tournament Arena and Guild Wars. So if you do want to focus on this guy, I recommend focusing the most on his passive ability, as it's more consistent and you could pump out a summon each turn, and it also increases his melee damage. Meanwhile, his active ability is pretty inconsistent. Sometimes you can get up to like 3 to 4 Grots if you're lucky, but sometimes you'll only be able to get 1 or 2, and in that case it's not as useful as his passive. So overall, this guy is pretty strong. He's definitely the main carry for the campaign, and I would recommend focusing on him, especially if you're trying to get through the Octarius campaign. Our next character is Gib Scraps, and he has the trait Mechanic. His passive ability makes so that friendly adjacent units have additional armor, and his active ability summons a Grot tank with additional health for each round that is passed. This is a super powerful summon that does a ton of damage and is super tanky. Overall, Gib Scraps is a pretty decent unit, and that's just because of his active ability. His passive ability is decent in buffing the tankiness and helping keep your units alive, especially in the campaign where you're trying to get the 3-star, but his active ability is super important in the campaign and is what I use to clear the entire campaign while having pretty much everyone at Bronze 1. If you get his Grot tank to high enough level, it can pretty much solo the entire campaign for you, and it can also be useful in a couple other different game modes, such as legendary release events where he can slot in nicely in some teams. And you don't actually need to level this guy too much, which is nice because only his active is really useful. Him himself is not super useful. He does have a heal as his regular move each turn, and he does have the buffing armor, but mostly you want to focus on this guy for his summon. So overall, he's an okay unit. He's one of the better Orcs, and if you want to focus on this guy, I recommend just pumping up his active ability as far as you can get it. Our next character is Snappereka, and he has the traits Mechanical, Big Target, Explodes, and Daka. So for attacks at range 2, he has 2 additional hits. His passive ability makes it so that he ignores armor and reduces the target's armor. And his active ability is just a big melee hit, which also damages himself. Overall, Snappereka is a super weak unit, and I wouldn't recommend focusing on this guy at all. I would say just get him to the level where he can survive for you to clear the campaign and completely abandon him there, because any resources that you use on this guy are going to be wasted until he gets a rework. His active ability is really bad, as it can usually kill himself, which is super bad, especially in game modes like Campaign, where you're trying really hard to get the 3-star. So I would definitely leave this guy the lowest you could possibly get, and use your resources on better characters, even better Orcs such as Snotflaga or Gib Scraps. Next is Tank Smasher, and his passives are Unstoppable and Beast Slayer. His passive ability makes it so that the first enemy that deals damage to him with melee takes an additional 2 hits from his attacks. And his active ability, basically he charges in one of 6 directions in a straight line and will knock and deal damage to all the enemies in his path. Overall, Tank Smash It is another orc that is super weak, and I wouldn't recommend putting any resources in this guy, especially because he's an optional unit for the campaign, so I wouldn't focus on this guy at all until he gets a complete rework, as he's one of the worst characters in the entire game right now. Our last orc is Boss Gorets. He has the passes Mechanical, Big Target, Final Vengeance, and Daka. His passive ability makes it so that whenever he attacks in melee, he deals an additional ranged attack to either the target, or if that target is defeated, to another random enemy. And his active ability makes so that all friendly characters within 3 hexes that have not already taken action this turn immediately take action and attack the nearest enemy, and they have +1 movement and additional damage. Overall, Boss Gorets is kind of a mediocre unit. He's decent just because some of the orcs are so weak and he's necessary for the campaign, but I do kind of regret focusing on this guy so much. I thought his passive would be a little bit more useful and that he would be able to clear 2 enemies each turn, but even at Silver 1, his damage is still really weak and he won't be able to really kill 2 enemies. You're lucky if you're able to kill a single enemy with both his normal attack and his passive proccing. His active ability is pretty interesting and seems like it should be pretty strong or useful in some game modes, but I haven't really found a use for it, as you can't use the character's affected active abilities that turn. So overall, he's a decent unit and you do need to level him up a bit for the campaign, but I wouldn't recommend focusing on this guy too much, and I would instead focus on Snotflugga, who I think would be a better carry for the Octarius campaign. Our next faction is the Elari, who you use in the Sam Hine campaign. They also don't have a faction passive, so we're just going to get right into it with Calandus. He has the traits Overwatch and Heavy Weapon, so if he hasn't moved this turn, he deals an additional 25% damage with his ranged attacks. His passive ability makes so that when the first time he's attacked in melee, he immediately counterattacks, and if that enemy is defeated, he won't take any of the damage. And his active ability just allows him to move again during a turn and take less damage from ranged attacks in the next turn. Overall, Calandus is a pretty good unit. He's very useful in the campaign and one of the required units, but he's also really shines in PvP content such as Tournament Arena, where he's super powerful as he can deal out a ton of damage and kill units just passively on the enemy's turn. And his active can also be super useful in that game mode for getting a really nice position and making him a bit tankier so he doesn't get sniped first turn. If you want to focus on this guy, I recommend focusing on his passive ability, as this allows him to counterattack and you want to be able to kill that unit so you won't take any of the damage. Our next character is Athena, and she has the traits Deep Strike and Flying. Her passive ability makes it so that friendly units within 2 hexes gain additional damage and crit % chance. And her active ability allows her to go in a straight line and damage units. Overall, Athena is a really strong character, and that's because of her passive ability, which buffs friendly units. Buffing characters in this game is super powerful, and she really shines in game modes like Guild Raids, where you want to pump out a ton of damage with all your characters in a single turn. Overall, I do recommend focusing on this character, and especially her passive ability, as she can be useful to you in a ton of different game modes and helps your even better characters shine. And she's also a required unit in the campaign, so you will need to level her regardless. Our next character is Eldrion, and he has the trait Psyker. His passive ability makes it so that enemies 2 hexes away take additional damage. And his active ability is just a psychic attack that deals additional damage for each round that is passed. Overall, Eldrion is probably one of the strongest units in the entire game, and that's because of his passive ability. This damage applies to every hit that your characters do and can add up to tremendous amounts, especially in game modes such as Guild Raids, and can also help you punch up against stronger teams in game modes like Arena. I would definitely recommend focusing on this guy as much as possible and to focus the most on his passive ability, as his active isn't super important or useful. I would pump up his passive ability as far as you could possibly get it and to dump all your resources into this ability, as it will make all your other characters seem so much stronger. He's also required in the campaign and is the main carry for that campaign, so I wouldn't neglect leveling up his rank, because just with his normal attack being a Psyker, he can kill up to 2 enemies each turn. Our next character is Mugan Ra, and he has the traits Overwatch, Heavy Weapon, and Terrifying, so he takes minus 30% damage from melee attacks. His passive ability makes so that he gets additional crit percent chance and damage if he hasn't moved. And his active ability is just a super powerful multi-hit ranged attack that deals a ton of damage. Overall, Mugan Ra is a super powerful character, and he's probably the strongest ranged damage dealer in the entire game. He also has the heavy weapon trait, so he benefits from Thaddeus' passive. Main uses for this guy is probably guild raids, where you can dish out a ton of damage against guild raid bosses, and he's also useful in the campaign, as you can bring up to 5 units in a lot of the missions. So if you have this guy, I would definitely recommend focusing on him and leveling up both his passive and active abilities. Our last Eldari is Jane Zar, and she has the trait Infiltrate, so she'll never trigger Overwatch. Her passive ability makes so that adjacent enemies deal less damage and have minus 1 hits to their melee attacks. And her active ability throws a shuriken that can bounce between adjacent enemies and deal a ton of AoE damage. Overall, Jane Zar is pretty decent. She's really good in PvP game modes because of her Infiltrate ability, so she can go up to super strong Overwatch characters like Revos and completely decimate them with their active ability before they're able to damage your team. She's also useful in the campaign, as she's the only Eldari character with an AoE ability and can take out multiple enemies during one turn. If you're lucky enough to have this guy, I would definitely recommend focusing on her active ability and pumping up the damage so she's able to kill a ton of units. Her passive ability is also decent, but the main strength I see from this ability is the reduction in the hits and not so much the reduction in the damage. She also has some fringe uses in guild raids because she has a high pierce ratio of 80% with her melee attacks, which can be useful against bosses such as the Rogel Dorn tank, which are super tanky and have a ton of armor. Our next faction is the Tyranids. They also don't have a universal passive. So our first character is Tyrant Guard. He has the traits Crushing Strike, so he deals an additional 50% damage with his melee attacks if he hasn't moved. And Big Target. His passive ability makes so that if he hasn't moved, adjacent allies take less damage. And his active ability is an AoE melee that can taunt an enemy and push back adjacent enemies. Overall, Tyrant Guard really shines in one particular game mode, and that's legendary release events, where his passive ability is super powerful in making all your units super tanky and helping you survive in later rounds. The Tyranids right now don't have their own campaign, so I only recommend focusing on any of these characters if you really want them for the specific game mode they shine in. And for Tyrant Guard, that's definitely legendary release events, and he's a super powerful character in that game mode, and I would focus the most on his passive ability so your units take the least amount of damage. Our next Tyrant is the Winged Prime, and she has the passes Final Vengeance, Flying, and Synapse, so friendly units within 2 hexes with the instinctive behavior trait can ignore battle fatigue, and that basically just refers to mostly Tyranid summons. His passive ability makes so that whenever he attacks, he summons a Hormigaunt spawn. And his active ability makes it so that if he has not moved this turn, he could summon a super powerful summon, being a Tyranid warrior, which also has the Synapse trait, which means if it's in 2 hexes of the Winged Prime, it can also summon a Hormigaunt whenever it attacks. So overall, Winged Prime is a pretty strong character. The only reason he's not super useful right now is because the Tyranids don't have their own campaign. But if they did, I would say he'd probably be the carry for that campaign with all his summons and the amount of summons he could spam out, especially with his active ability and the Tyranid warrior. Where he does shine the most though is in PvP content, such as Guild War, where he can summon a ton of units over time and completely wither down your enemies. So overall, if you do want to focus on this guy, I would recommend using him in PvP and focusing on both his active and his passive abilities. Next is the Death Leaper, and she has the traits Terrifying, Infiltrate, Deep Strike, and Camouflage, so she takes less hits from ranged attacks. Her passive ability makes so she comes into contact with her target this turn. She deals additional damage, heals herself, and suppresses the enemy. Her active ability, if she hasn't moved, will suppress all enemy units within 2 hexes and allow her to vanish so she can't take any damage for the next round. And after that round, she will deal additional damage and be able to move to any free hex on the battlefield. Overall, the Death Leaper is a pretty weird unit and doesn't really have that many uses right now. The main use I could see for her is in Tournament Arena, where she can be a super elusive single target melee nuker. But I haven't really found too much use for her myself, and I wouldn't really recommend focusing on this unit unless you want to test her out in Tournament Arena for those uses. Our last Tyranid is the Neuro, and she has the passive Synapse, Shadow in the Warp, so enemy Psychers deal less psychic damage, Psyker, Flying, and Close Combat weakness, so if she starts the turn adjacent to an enemy, she'll deal minus 50% melee damage and minus 25% range damage. Her passive ability is Neuro Parasite, so anytime an enemy takes psychic damage, they'll get a stack of this Neuro Parasite, which will increase the amount of psychic damage that they take. And her active ability is a single target psychic damage nuke, which will also heal herself as well as any friendly adjacent Tyranids. Overall, the Neurothrope is a super powerful character, particularly in the Guild Raids game mode, where she can dish out a ton of damage with her passive ability, which can keep stacking up psychic damage until it gets to really absurd numbers and does a ton of damage each turn. You typically pair her with other psychic damage dealers like Abraxas, whose summons can pump out a ton of psychic damage in a single turn. Other units like Ahriman and Eldrion, which buff psychic damage and can help you deal additional damage with the team, and other powerful psychos like Roswitha. So overall, this unit is weak in every other game mode, but really shines in Guild Raids, where it's one of the strongest teams and can deal a ton of damage if done correctly. Our last Xenos faction is the Tau, and they also don't have a universal passive or currently have a campaign. Our first character is Shosul, and he has the traits Camouflage and Close Combat weakness. His passive ability makes so that instead of a ranged attack, he summons a sniper drone, which immediately attacks the enemy. His active ability targets an enemy, and at the beginning of his next turn, that enemy will take a ton of damage. Overall, Shosul is a really powerful character. He's super strong in a couple of different game modes, such as PvP and Tournament Arena. He's really strong with his summons, as he can do a ton of range damage. He can also be super useful in Guild Raids with a specific team, the Exetor Row team and the Mechanical team, because of his summons that are mechanical and will trigger Exetor's Row passive to attack again. So overall, he is a super useful unit, and I would definitely recommend focusing on his passive, as that's what really makes him shine in these game modes. But he doesn't currently have a campaign, so he's not as useful as some of the other Xenos units that are integral to their own campaigns. Our next character is Revos, and she has the traits Mechanical, Flying, Big Target, and Close Combat weakness. She also has a 6-hit melee attack and a 6-hit ranged attack. Her passive ability gives her an additional 3 hits on her ranged attacks. And her active ability summons 2 shield drones, which are super tanky, and immediately puts her into Overwatch. And while overwatching, as long as she defeats the enemy, she will remain in Overwatch until the end of the turn. Overall, Revos is a super powerful unit and useful in a ton of different game modes. She's super strong in game modes such as Guild Raids, where her ranged attacks have a ton of multi-hits and can deal a ton of damage with her passive ability, especially when paired with damage buffers like Eldrion. And she could also be useful in the Mechanical Guild Raids team, because she's mechanical and can trigger Exetor Row. She's also super useful in game modes like Legendary Release Events and Arena, because of her active ability, where she can wipe out an entire team just passively sitting there during the enemy's turn. So overall, even though she doesn't currently have a campaign, I would still recommend on focusing on this unit a ton, as she's super useful in pretty much all the game modes of the game. I would focus on her passive for game modes like Guild Raids and dealing more single target damage, and her active for game modes like Onslaught and Arena, where you want to just be able to kill all the enemies as fast as possible. Next is Darkstrider, and he has the traits Suppressive Fire, Infiltrate, and Close Combat weakness. His passive ability makes it that units hit by his ranged attacks gain a marker light, which will make them take 15% additional damage from Tau units. His active ability gives all adjacent enemies a marker light and gives them fewer hits and less damage for 1 round. Overall, Dark Strider is a decent unit. He's really bad on his own, but his marker light ability can be super useful in game modes such as guild raids and buffing the damage of super important damage dealers like Revos and Shul. So I wouldn't really recommend focusing on this guy too much, but if you do already have a team with Revos and Shul set up, he can be a decent supplemental unit to increase that team's damage. Next is the legendary Anshi. His passive ability grants himself and adjacent allies these 3 cycling buffs. So the first time you'll get -% damage, then you'll get additional movement, then you'll get additional damage, and these will just cycle as the turns go by. His active ability restores the health of an ally as well as refreshes their active ability. Overall, Anshi can be a really powerful character when paired with other units that have really strong active abilities, such as Ragnar, who does a ton of additional melee damage, and Bellator can get another full round of summons. He's also useful for passively upgrading all your units and can be useful in game modes such as legendary release events, where you can reset an important active and buff your units for the entire round, as well as game modes such as guild raids, where his active ability really shines and can reset the active of super important characters like Ragnar and Bellator. So overall, if you have this guy, I would recommend focusing on both of his abilities, but doing a preference on his active ability, as when he refreshes an ally's active, it will only be to the level of whichever is the lowest between his active and that ally's. Our last unit is Shadow Sun, and she has the traits Infiltrate, Flying, Camouflage, and Close Combat weakness. Her passive ability makes so that friendly units adjacent to either her or her summon deal additional damage with ranged attacks. And her active ability allows her to disappear and teleport to any hex on the battlefield, dealing additional damage and summoning a command link drone. Overall, Shadow Sun is kind of an okay unit. She's a decent ranged damage dealer, and her passive can be somewhat useful in buffing the damage of your ranged attacks, but she isn't better than a lot of the other ranged damage dealer buffers such as Eldrion and other units like Thaddeus, who buffs heavy weapon attacks. So overall, Shadow Sun is okay, but kind of a niche pick and not really super useful in any game mode. So if you do happen to have her, I wouldn't focus on her too much, but she can still be useful if you really want to use her. Alright, so that does it for all the Xenos units currently in the game. One thing I will say about the Xenos faction is that in the campaigns, you can't use units from different Xenos factions. For example, in the Samhain campaign, you can only use the Elari, and you can't use, for example, the Necrons or the Orcs. And this makes you have to build a lot more Xenos units for the campaign than, say, Imperials and Chaos units, where you could use any Imperial and any Chaos units in the campaigns. And this makes the Xenos characters a little bit starved for resources, such as orbs and badges. So I would recommend being a little bit pickier with who you decide to level up. My 3 main recommendations would be Alfn, Eldrion, especially his passive, and Revos. I think those 3 units are super powerful, and I use them in pretty much every game mode all the time. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you guys learned something. These videos take a ton of time and effort to make, so if you want to thank me, please help me out by dropping a like and subscribing. You could also use my refer a friend code right here in Tacticus, and that'll really help me in making future videos. I've already started working on the last video in this series, which is going to be the Imperial review, so I hope to see you guys in that one.